The Texas wind in 1885 didn't just carry dust, it carried secrets. And that year, it was whispering about Elena Hartwell. Elena was 42 years old, a widow from Boston who had forgotten what it felt like to be a woman. She'd inherited a ranch the size of a small country from an uncle she barely knew. She came to Texas to bury her ghosts. But she was about to meet a new one. His name was Jake Morrison. He was 22. And the first time she saw him, he was breaking a wild stallion in the corral. He didn't use force. He used a kind of language that only horses and desperate souls understand. His hands were poetry. His eyes were war. 20 years separated them. A lifetime. But when he looked up from the dust and his eyes met hers, 20 years felt like nothing. The electricity that shot between them could have lit up the whole territory. And in that moment, Elena felt something dangerous awaken inside her. Something that promised ruin. She should have turned away. She should have fired him on the spot, but she didn't. And that was her first mistake. The Double H Ranch was a harsh paradise. Endless sky, brutal sun, and the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heart break. Elena had inherited it from her Uncle Ezra, a man who saw the wild streak she kept hidden beneath her Boston lace. He saw that she was untamable, and he left her a kingdom of dust and wind to prove it. The second time she saw Jake Morrison, he was washing off the day's grime in the horse trough. The setting sun turned the water to liquid gold as it streamed down his chest. He was built by hard work and harder living, every muscle earned. But it was his face that truly stopped her. His eyes were a pale, haunting blue. They held the kind of shadows a man twice his age shouldn't have to carry. He'd seen things that left scars you couldn't see. He noticed her watching and straightened up. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was like rough whiskey. It was respectful, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Something that made her pulse jump. "I'm Elena Hartwell," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The new owner." She held out a gloved hand, trying not to stare at the way his wet hair clung to his neck. "And you are?" "Jake Morrison, ma'am. Your foreman, if you'll have me." His calloused hand swallowed hers. Even through the leather glove, she felt a jolt, a searing heat that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. It was a warning, a promise. "I understand if you want to bring in your own people," he added, his eyes never leaving hers. She found her voice. "Can you handle the work, Mr. Morrison?" He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. A small scar above his left eyebrow seemed to deepen. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I can handle whatever you need handling." The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. She knew right then she was standing on the edge of a cliff. Every instinct screamed at her to step back. He didn't look at her like a boss. He looked at her like a woman worth wanting, a woman worth ruining. Instead of walking away, she heard herself say, "Then the job is yours." 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of stolen glances across the dusty corral. 3 weeks of him calling her ma'am in a tone that felt like a caress. The other ranch hands saw it. They whispered when she walked by. The whole ranch was a tinderbox, and she and Jake were 2 lit matches. All it needed was a wind. And one day, the wind came. It was a dust storm, a biblical wall of brown death that rolled across the prairie. Elena was out riding the fence line, miles from the house. The sky turned black in an instant. The world disappeared. Just as her horse began to panic, a shape emerged from the swirling dust. It was Jake. He pulled her from her saddle onto his own horse without a word, his arm a band of steel around her waist. His body was a shield against the storm, his breath hot on her ear as he shouted over the roar. They rode for a line shack, a tiny wooden box in the middle of nowhere. They stumbled inside, gasping, just as the full fury of the storm hit. And then there was silence, a deafening, terrifying silence. The one-room cabin was lit by a single lantern. It cast long shadows that danced on Jake's face. His shirt was soaked, clinging to his chest. Elena stood frozen, aware of nothing but him. The small space crackled with a tension worse than the storm outside. "Should blow over by morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. But his eyes weren't neutral. His eyes were on her throat, where the top button of her shirt had come undone. They lingered on her chest, where the wet fabric revealed more than it concealed. She tried to say his name to put a wall between them. "Mr. Morrison," she whispered. It came out sounding like an invitation. "Ma'am." He took one step, then another, until he was so close she could feel the heat rolling off his body, until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "Tell me to stop, Elena," he murmured, his voice raw. "Tell me to stop, and I will walk out that door and into the storm." She should have said it. Everything she was, a proper Boston widow, a ranch owner, a woman of standing, screamed at her to say it. He was a boy, young enough to be her. She couldn't even think the word. But the woman she had buried long ago, the woman who craved fire and life, refused to speak. Instead, her hand came up, and her finger traced the small scar above his eye. He sucked in a sharp breath. His hand covered hers, pressing it flat against his cheek. His skin was rough with stubble, hot to the touch. "Elena," he breathed. Her name on his lips was a sin and a prayer. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man dying of thirst. It was desperate and hungry and demanding. It tasted of coffee and dust and a fierce, masculine need that shattered her defenses. And she answered with 20 years of pent-up passion. Her arms went around his neck, pulling him closer, her body arching against his without shame. His hands were rough but sure, finding the buttons of her shirt, pushing the wet fabric aside. His palms on her bare skin felt like a brand. She should have felt scandalized. Instead, she felt alive. His mouth left hers, trailing a line of fire down her throat to the lace edge of her corset. She gasped his name. He laid her down on a rough wool blanket by the fire, and in the flickering light, they became two souls clinging together against the storm. He moved with an intuitive grace, a perfect understanding of what she needed, what she had craved for so long. When he was poised above her, his blue eyes were dark pools of passion. In that moment, he wasn't a boy. He was her salvation and her damnation. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blanket, listening to the wind howl. Her head was on his chest, his fingers absently tracing patterns in her hair. "This is madness," she whispered against his skin. His chest rumbled with a low chuckle. "Maybe," he said, "but it's the sanest I've felt since I came back from the war." There it was again, the war. Before she could ask, he was asleep. And Elena lay awake, listening to the storm inside and out, wondering what kind of hell she had just unleashed. The morning dawned bright and cruel. The storm was gone, but a new one was brewing. They rode back to the ranch house in silence, a chasm of unspoken words between them. But the ranch hands didn't need words. They saw it in the way Jake couldn't stop looking at her. They saw it in the way Elena couldn't quite meet anyone's eye. The judgment in their stares was a physical thing. By noon, the whispers had started. By sundown, the whispers had reached town. And by nightfall, they had reached the ears of Reverend Michaels. He appeared on her porch like a dark omen, his Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon. His eyes burned with a cold, righteous fire. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "I have heard disturbing reports." "My foreman is my business, Reverend," Elena said, her voice tight. "When it becomes a scandal that threatens the moral fabric of this community, it becomes the business of God," he thundered. "You are a woman of property, a pillar of society. That boy, he is a child." The words were meant to shame her, to cut her down. And they did. Just then, the screen door creaked open. Jake stepped out onto the porch, his presence solid and unwavering behind her. "Reverend," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "I think the lady's business is her own." The Reverend's face turned a blotchy red. "And what business is that, boy? Seducing grieving widows? Preying on their loneliness for your own gain?" Elena felt Jake go rigid. The air crackled with a sudden, violent tension. "You should be careful what you say, Reverend." Jake's voice was now dangerously soft. "A man can say things he can't take back." "Is that a threat, Morrison?" "It's a promise." The Reverend stormed off, but his poison lingered in the air. That night, Elena looked out her window and saw Jake in the corral, his silhouette stark against the moon. Was she saving him, or was she destroying them both? She was so lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice the man watching her from the shadows of the barn. He wasn't a ranch hand, and he wasn't there to admire the view. He was there to report back. Because the Reverend was just the opening act. The real storm was still coming. It arrived on the Tuesday train. His name was Clayton Hartwell, her late husband's brother. He stepped onto the platform in a three-piece suit that probably cost more than the entire town of Sunset Ridge. He had the soft hands of a man who profited from other people's sweat and the pale, cold eyes of a predator. "Elena, darling," he said, kissing the air beside her cheek. "You look rustic." "Clayton," she said, her guard instantly up. "I wasn't expecting you." The family was worried. "We've heard the most shocking tales." His smile was thin like a razor cut. "Living out here alone, consorting with your hired help, a boy no less. What would dear Charles have thought?" The mention of her dead husband was a deliberate, cruel jab. "Charles is dead, Clayton. My life is my own." "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken, my dear." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his briefcase with a flourish. "Uncle Ezra's will. I took the liberty of having my lawyers in Boston examine it. It seems there's a morality clause." Elena's blood ran cold. "You're lying." "Am I?" His smile widened. "It states that should you engage in behavior deemed morally turpitudinous or likely to bring shame upon the Hartwell name, control of all assets, including this ranch, reverts to the next male heir." He tapped his chest. "Conveniently, that's me." She stared at the papers, her world tilting on its axis. "No court would enforce such a thing," she stammered. "Wouldn't they?" Clayton's voice was smug. "Let's see, a respected grieving widow and her lover, a drifter, 20 years her junior. The story tells itself, Elena. You've handed me this ranch on a silver platter." He had her. He knew he had her. The town was already against her. The Reverend would testify. It was a perfect trap. Later that night, Jake found her in the parlor, staring into the flames of the fireplace. She told him everything, the will, the clause, the trap. "He can take it all," she whispered. "Unless—" "Unless what?" Jake asked, his young face tight with a helpless anger. She finally turned to look at him, her heart shattering. "Unless I send you away," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Unless I prove that you meant nothing, that it was all a terrible, foolish mistake." Jake stood there for a long time, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackling fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "Is that what this was, Elena? A mistake?" The question was a blade twisting in her gut. What she wanted was to scream that he was the only thing that had ever felt right. But what she said was, "What I want doesn't matter anymore." He simply nodded, his face an unreadable mask, and walked out. She listened to his footsteps fade, each one a hammer blow to her heart. She had chosen the ranch over the man, but Clayton Hartwell wasn't just going to take the ranch. He was going to burn her entire world to the ground, and he wasn't going to do it with lawyers. The very next day, things started to go wrong. A section of fence was cut, and 100 head of cattle scattered to the winds. A prize bull turned up dead, its water trough laced with poison. Mysterious riders were spotted at the edge of the property, their faces hidden by shadows and bandanas. The ranch hands started getting nervous. One quit after being cornered in town by 2 thugs who suggested he find healthier employment. Another packed his bags after his saddle was slashed to ribbons during the night. "This is Clayton's work," Jake said, his voice grim. He was examining the hoof prints near the poisoned trough. He hadn't left. He was still her foreman, his demeanor professional and distant, the space between them a frozen wasteland. "These aren't just thugs," he said, pointing at a specific print. "That's a shod horse, special kind of shoe. I've seen it before." "Where?" Elena asked, loading her rifle. She was done being a victim. Jake hesitated, his eyes dark with a past he never talked about. "He's a man named Blackjack Sullivan, meanest hired gun this side of the Pecos. If Clayton hired Blackjack, he's not trying to scare you anymore. He's planning a war." "Then a war it is," Elena said, her jaw set. "No," Jake said, grabbing her arm. His touch, even in anger, sent a shock through her. "You don't get it, Elena. This isn't a fight you can win. Sullivan and his crew, they don't leave witnesses. Walk away. Let Clayton have the ranch. It's not worth your life." She looked into his eyes, into the deep, desperate worry he couldn't hide behind his anger. And in that moment, she made her choice. It wasn't about the land anymore. It was never just about the land. "I'm not running, Jake," she said softly. "Not from him, and not from you." Something flickered in his eyes. Hope. Fear. He opened his mouth to argue, but it was too late. A rifle shot cracked from the distant hills, the bullet kicking up dust just inches from her feet. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. The war had begun. They retreated to the ranch house, the remaining loyal hands taking up positions. There were only 4 of them left, against what Jake estimated to be at least a dozen of Blackjack's men. The siege lasted for 2 days. They were cut off, surrounded. At night, the riders would circle the house, their whoops and hollers like the cries of hyenas. They'd fire shots into the walls just to keep them from sleeping, to wear them down. Clayton was out there somewhere, watching, waiting for them to break. On the 3rd morning, at the gray hour just before dawn, the real attack came. It started with a volley of shots that shattered every window on the ground floor. Glass rained down like deadly ice. "Get down!" Jake roared, pulling Elena behind an overturned oak table. Bullets tore through the adobe walls, splintering furniture, kicking up plaster dust that choked the air. The house was being torn apart around them. One of the ranch hands, a boy named Billy, cried out and slumped to the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Elena's stomach lurched. This was real. People were dying. She raised her rifle over the table and fired blindly toward a muzzle flash she saw near the barn. The world had dissolved into a terrifying symphony of cracking rifles and splintering wood. "They're trying to pin us in the front!" Jake yelled over the noise. "They'll send men around the back. We have to hold them." They fought back with a desperate fury. Jake was a force of nature, moving from window to window, his shots measured and deadly. He wasn't just a cowboy. He was a soldier. He'd done this before. Elena fought beside him, the recoil of the rifle a brutal comfort against her shoulder. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. Another ranch hand went down, clutching his leg. It was just her and Jake and one old-timer named Hank left. Suddenly, a new sound joined the chaos. Fire. Someone had thrown a torch onto the porch roof. The dry shingles went up like kindling. Flames began to lick at the window frames. "They're burning us out!" Hank croaked, his face pale with terror. They were trapped. Smoke started to fill the room, thick and acrid. They could be shot, or they could burn. This was Clayton's justice. Through the smoke, Elena saw a figure step out from behind the water tower. It was Clayton himself, flanked by 2 of Blackjack's men. He held a megaphone to his lips. "Elena, it's over! Give up the boy and I'll let you walk away!" The offer was obscene. He was asking her to trade Jake's life for her own. "Don't listen to him!" Jake snarled, reloading his Winchester. "He'll kill us both!" "This is your last chance, Elena," Clayton's voice boomed. "Give me Morrison." Why? Why was he so obsessed with Jake? It wasn't just about the affair. It was something more, something personal. "What does he want with you?" she gasped, coughing as the smoke thickened. Jake's face was a grim mask. "It's not me he wants. It's what I know." Before she could ask what he meant, a section of the roof collapsed, showering the room in a cascade of fiery embers. They had seconds to live. "The root cellar!" Jake yelled, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the kitchen. They scrambled across the floor as bullets chewed up the floorboards around them. Jake kicked open the heavy cellar door, shoved her down the ladder, and followed, slamming the hatch shut just as the main part of the ceiling gave way with a deafening roar. They were plunged into darkness, the sounds of the fire and the gunfight muffled above them. They were alive, but they were buried. In the suffocating dark of the cellar, the only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the muffled roar of the fire consuming the house above them. Jake fumbled for a match, his hand shaking. In the sudden, sputtering flare of light, Elena saw that his sleeve was soaked in blood. "You're hit," she said, her voice flat with shock. "It's a graze," he grunted, lighting a dusty lantern. It wasn't just a graze. A bullet had torn a nasty furrow along his forearm. She ripped a strip from her petticoat and began to bandage it, her hands moving with a strange, numb efficiency. "What did you mean up there?" she asked, her voice quiet. "It's what I know." "What do you know, Jake?" He stared at the cellar wall, his jaw tight. The lantern light carved deep shadows into his face, making him look older, harder. "My name isn't Jake Morrison," he said, not looking at her. The words dropped into the silence like stones in a well. "I was a Union scout during the war," he continued, his voice low and raspy. "My real name is Jesse McCabe. My unit was ambushed in Tennessee. We were carrying a payroll. Gold. $250,000. Elena stopped wrapping the bandage, her blood turning to ice. "We were betrayed," Jesse said, "by our own commanding officer, a man named Major Charles Hartwell. Charles, her husband, her sainted, heroic, dead husband." "No," she whispered. "That's impossible. Charles died a hero at Gettysburg." "He faked his death at Gettysburg," Jesse said, his voice laced with a bitter poison that had been brewing for years. "He took the gold, killed his own men to cover his tracks, and disappeared. I was the only one who survived. I saw him. I saw him shoot my friends in the back." Elena felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her entire life, her entire marriage, had been a lie. "I've been hunting him for 10 years, Jesse said. "He changed his name, created a new life, but there were whispers, rumors of a man who got rich overnight, who moved to Boston. Then I heard a story about a wealthy Bostonian's widow inheriting a massive ranch in Texas from an eccentric uncle. A ranch bought for cash right after the war. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Clayton, the will, the morality clause. "Clayton doesn't want the ranch," Elena breathed, understanding dawning. "He's looking for the gold." "Your husband never trusted banks," Jesse said. "My guess is he buried it somewhere on this property." "Clayton knows it's here, and he knows I'm the only other person alive who knows the story. That's why he wanted me, dead or alive. He needs to silence me for good." Above them, the fire roared. The gunshots had stopped. A new sound began. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was trying to break through the cellar door. They were trapped underground with a truth that could destroy them and a man who would stop at nothing to bury it forever. The thumping grew louder, more frantic. Wood splintered. "He thinks we burned," Jesse whispered, grabbing his rifle. "He's coming for the gold." The cellar door suddenly burst open, showering them with debris and smoke. A silhouette stood framed against the fiery red glow of the burning house. It wasn't Clayton. It was Blackjack Sullivan, his face a demonic mask in the firelight, a Colt revolver steady in his hand. "Well, well," Blackjack rasped, his eyes glittering. "Look what the cat dragged in. The ghost of Tennessee and the pretty widow." He wasn't there for the gold. He was there for Jesse. "Clayton offered me 10,000 to put you in the ground, McCabe," Blackjack sneered. "But I think I'll do it for free. You and your friends cost me a brother in that ambush." It was personal. Everything was personal. Before Jesse could raise his rifle, Blackjack fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Jesse cried out not in pain, but in warning, shoving Elena hard against the stone wall. The bullet, meant for his heart, tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder instead. He staggered, his rifle clattering to the dirt floor. Blackjack grinned, a predator savoring the kill. He cocked his revolver for the finishing shot, but he made a mistake. He took his eyes off Elena. In that split second, she lunged for Jesse's fallen rifle, her grief and rage coalescing into a single point of cold, deadly focus. She wasn't a Boston widow anymore. She was a survivor. She brought the rifle up and fired from the hip. The blast threw Blackjack backward as if he'd been hit by a mule. He landed in a heap at the top of the stairs, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark hole blossoming in the center of his chest. Silence descended once more, thick and heavy. Elena scrambled over to Jesse, who was slumped against the wall, his face pale, his breathing shallow. "Jesse," she said, her voice shaking, "stay with me." His eyes fluttered open. "Knew you were a fighter," he mumbled, a weak smile touching his lips. They could hear voices outside, Clayton's voice, angry and impatient. "What's taking so long? Did you find them?" They were still trapped. Jesse was badly wounded. The house was an inferno. But now they had a weapon. Hope. Jesse looked past her, toward the back of the cellar. "The old tornado shelter. Ezra showed it to me once. There's a tunnel, leads out to the creek bed." With Elena supporting most of his weight, they staggered through the clutter of the cellar to a low stone archway hidden behind a stack of empty barrels. A heavy wooden door, warped with age, was set into the stone. It was barred from their side. They could escape. They slid the heavy iron bar free, the screech of metal on metal gratingly loud. Behind them they heard Clayton shouting again, closer this time. He was coming down into the cellar. They slipped through the doorway into a narrow, earth-walled tunnel and pulled the door shut, plunging themselves into absolute blackness. They were alive, but they were running. And Clayton now knew exactly where the gold wasn't, which meant he would tear the entire ranch apart until he found it. The tunnel was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. It was a tomb. Elena half-carried Jesse, his arm draped over her shoulders, his blood warm and sticky against her dress. Every step was agony for him, but he never complained. They stumbled on in the darkness, feeling their way along the rough-hewn walls. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint circle of gray light ahead, the exit. It emerged into a thicket of mesquite bushes down by the creek bed, 100 yards from the burning ranch house. They collapsed onto the muddy bank, hidden from view, gasping for air. The ranch house was a roaring pyre against the dawn sky. Figures on horseback were circling it. Clayton's men. They were watching the fire, confident their problems were turning to ash. "We have to get away," Elena whispered, her mind racing. "Get to the sheriff in Austin." Jesse shook his head, wincing in pain. "By the time we get there, Clayton will have the gold and be halfway to Mexico. The law here, Clayton owns them. That judge he mentioned? He's in Clayton's pocket. No one will believe us." He was right. They were fugitives. He was a wanted man, and she was his accomplice. Their story was unbelievable. "The gold is the proof," Jesse rasped, his eyes feverish. "The payroll box had a specific Army serial number. It's the only thing that can prove my story. And condemn your husband." He coughed, a racking sound that shook his whole body. He was fading fast. "Where is it?" Elena asked, her voice urgent. "Jesse, where did Charles hide it?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But your uncle must have. That's why Charles, or Clayton, killed him. Ezra must have found the gold or gotten suspicious. He left you the ranch for a reason, Elena. He was trying to tell you something." A clue. Her uncle had left her a clue. But what? Her mind raced back over the past few weeks, the letters from her uncle, the deed to the ranch, his personal effects. Wait. The letter, the first letter she received from his lawyer. It had seemed strange at the time, full of odd, capitalized words that didn't make sense. She dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man. "My dearest niece," it began, "I leave you this treasure of a ranch. Always remember our family's foundation. The past is the key. Never forget your roots." It wasn't rambling. It was a code. Treasure, foundation, key, roots. Her eyes darted around the burned-out landscape. The foundation, not the house. The old foundation. The original cabin that her great-grandfather had built when he first settled this land. It was nothing but a crumbling stone square now, overgrown with weeds, a stone's throw from the family cemetery. The roots. The old oak tree. The biggest, oldest tree on the property, right in the center of the old foundation. The key. She fumbled in the small reticule she still had slung over her shoulder. Miraculously, it had survived. Inside was the key to the main house, a heavy, ornate iron key. But it didn't just open the door. She remembered the real estate agent mentioning it, a strange feature. The head of the key was decorated with the Hartwell family crest, a stylized oak tree. And the barrel of the key wasn't solid. It was hollow and shaped like a star, like a wrench. There was something on the old oak tree, something that needed a special key. "The old foundation," she said aloud. "The big oak tree." Jesse's eyes widened in understanding. "We have to get there before they do." But as they peered through the bushes, they saw Clayton and his two remaining men riding away from the fire. They were riding directly toward the old foundation. He knew. He'd found another clue. Or maybe he'd known all along. They were out of time. Jesse tried to push himself up, but collapsed back with a groan. He was too weak to walk, let alone fight. It was up to her. "Stay here," she said, pressing the rifle into his hands. "If I'm not back by sunrise—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. He just nodded, his eyes filled with a terrible fear. Not for himself, for her. Elena took a deep breath, checked the revolver she'd taken from Blackjack's body, and began to crawl through the underbrush. She was going back into the lion's den. Alone. She moved like a ghost through the scrubland, using the terrain her uncle had left her as a shield. The sky was turning from black to a bruised purple. Dawn was coming. She reached the low stone wall of the family cemetery and peered over it. There it was, the crumbling foundation of the original cabin, and in its center, the ancient, sprawling oak tree. Clayton and his men were already there. They had lanterns and shovels. "He said it was under the roots," one of the men said, his voice carrying on the still morning air. "Then start digging," Clayton snapped. He was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his fine suit ruined, his face smeared with soot. He was a man possessed by a decade of greed. Elena watched them, her heart pounding. The shovels were a distraction. The clue was the key. She scanned the massive trunk of the old oak, and then she saw it. On the side facing away from the men, almost completely obscured by thick bark, was a small iron plate, and in the center of the plate was a star-shaped hole. It was a lock, a custom-made lock that could only be opened by her front door key. Her uncle was a genius. He'd hidden the truth in plain sight. She had to get to that tree. But how? Then she saw her chance. The two henchmen were arguing over where to dig. Clayton, frustrated, shoved one of them. "Dig there, you imbecile!" he shrieked. In that moment of distraction, all three of them had their backs to her. It was now or never. Elena slipped over the cemetery wall, silent as a shadow, and sprinted across the open ground. Her feet barely made a sound on the soft earth. 10 yards. 5 yards. She reached the tree. Her body pressed against the rough bark, her breath held tight in her chest. She fumbled for the key, her fingers trembling. She slid it into the star-shaped lock. It fit perfectly. She turned it. There was a deep, grinding click from within the tree. A section of the bark at the base of the trunk, no bigger than a small door, popped open an inch. It was a hidden compartment, hollowed out of the tree itself. But the sound, quiet as it was enough. One of the men turned. His eyes widened. "Boss!" Clayton spun around. His face, when he saw her, was a mask of pure, murderous rage. "The key!" he hissed. "Of course!" He drew his pistol. "Give it to me, Elena. Give me what's mine." "It was never yours, Clayton," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "It was stolen, bought with the blood of good men." "Sentiment," he sneered. "It's always been your weakness." He took a step toward her. From the direction of the creek bed, a single rifle shot rang out. Clayton's henchman, the one closest to him, cried out and clutched his shoulder, dropping his shovel. "Jesse!" He was providing cover fire. He was weak, but his aim was still true. The second henchman panicked, firing wildly into the darkness toward the creek before turning and running for the horses. It was just her and Clayton. "Useless cowards!" Clayton spat, ignoring his wounded man. His eyes never left Elena. "It's just you and me now, like it always should have been." He lunged for her. She dodged back, pulling Blackjack's heavy revolver from her waistband. They stood there, 10 feet apart, pistols leveled, the first rays of the sun breaking over the horizon, painting the scene in hues of blood and gold. "You could have had a life with me, Elena," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "We could have shared this. But you chose a filthy, worthless cowboy instead." "He's a better man than you or my husband ever were," she retorted, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Charles was a visionary," Clayton yelled, his composure finally cracking. "He saw an opportunity and he took it. That gold was rusting in a government box. He put it to use. He built an empire. He was a thief and a murderer. He was my brother." He fired. She fired at the exact same moment. The world exploded in a simultaneous roar of gunpowder. Elena felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through her left arm. The impact spun her around, and she fell hard against the roots of the tree. The revolver slipped from her numb fingers. Clayton stood there, a look of triumph on his face. But the triumph quickly faded. A small dark red stain appeared on the front of his pristine white shirt. It grew wider. He looked down at his chest in disbelief. Then he looked back at her, his eyes wide with confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle came out. And then he fell, face down in the dirt his family had stolen, his hands reaching for a treasure he would never touch. Elena lay there, gasping, the pain in her arm a raging fire. She had won. She had survived. She looked inside the hollow of the tree. There, covered in cobwebs, was a heavy iron-strapped box with a U.S. Army serial number stamped on the lid. The truth. As consciousness began to fade, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up, expecting to see Jesse. But it wasn't Jesse. It was the old-timer Hank, the last of her loyal ranch hands, the one she thought had fled. And he wasn't alone. He was leading a horse, and on it, slumped over the saddle, was Jesse, barely conscious. Behind them rode a dozen men, their hats dusty, their faces hard, and each man wore the badge of a U.S. Marshal. "We got your message, ma'am," Hank said, tipping his hat as a marshal knelt beside her to tend to her wound. Elena stared in confusion. "Message?" Hank held up a small, empty bird cage. "Your uncle had a stash of carrier pigeons for emergencies. He told me if anything ever happened, I was to send word to a friend of his in Austin, a man who never believed the official story about that payroll." Her uncle had planned for this. He knew the truth would eventually lead to a war. He'd put all the pieces on the board, leaving it to her to make the final move. Justice hadn't been an accident. It had been an inheritance. 6 months later, Elena stood on a train platform in San Francisco. The salt-laced wind whipped strands of hair across her face, but she didn't mind. It was the wind of a new life. The payroll gold had been returned to the government. The story of Major Charles Hartwell, the traitor, was now a matter of public record, a stain on the family name that Clayton had so desperately tried to protect. Jesse McCabe was a hero. His name was cleared, and he was given a handsome reward for his decade-long pursuit of justice. The Double H Ranch, its main house now rebuilt, was sold to a family who wanted to raise cattle, not ghosts. The money, combined with Jesse's reward, was more than enough to start over. A man walked up beside her, his arm in a sling, a faint scar still visible above his left eyebrow. His pale blue eyes, once filled with war, were now clear and calm. "Ready for this, Elena?" Jesse asked. She smiled and took his hand. "I'm ready for anything, Jesse." They were an unlikely pair. A 43-year-old widow from Boston society and a 23-year-old former Army scout from Tennessee. The world would still whisper, people would still stare. But they had walked through fire together. They had earned their scars, and they had earned their peace. The conductor called out, "All aboard!" They stepped onto the train, not as fugitives running from the past, but as partners walking toward a future they would build together. Their love wasn't a scandal. It was a survival story. Sometimes the most unconventional love is the one that truly sets you free. If this story reminded you that the heart doesn't care about rules, hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe that true love is worth fighting for, no matter the odds, make sure you subscribe for more stories about the wild hearts who dared to break the mold.